Hello and welcome to today's episode. I am joined by Dmitriy Kalinin from VMware. He is the maintainer of Carvel, an open source toolchain for deploying to Kubernetes and making our lives easier. Hello, Dmitry. How are you?
Hey, David. Thanks for having me. I'm pretty good.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to this. Deploying to Kubernetes is far from an enjoyable experience, depending on the tools that we're using, and I'm hoping that you're going to show me some stuff today that's going to change my life for the better, right?
Hopefully.
Do you want to just then spend the next minute? I mean, feel free to tell us about Carvel, what problem it's trying to solve, and the different components that make it up.
Sure. Carvel started about a year ago. It was actually known as K14S before. We recently renamed it to Carvel. It started out as a few projects that I was working on, trying to improve what I saw as not a necessarily great experience deploying and managing configuration for Kubernetes. I think at a time I was trying to deploy Knative to my cluster. And, at the time, I think Knative had a hard dependency on Istio. And so I also had to install Istio. And then, Knative had about 100 different Kubernetes resources. So as you update throughout, versions, it was kind of hard to track what should be deleted, what should be created, updated, etc. Right? kubectl does some of that stuff, but I just didn't quite feel like I had, fine-grained control over that. And then, as I was kind of playing around and trying to deploy things to Kubernetes, I've also dealt with several Helm charts, and I always found it to be quite cumbersome to deal with textual templating. So I ended up kind of digging into that area as well. And so the first tool that came out of all that was YTT. This was the structural templating tool for YAML. The second tool I believe came out was kapp, or I guess some people call it kapp. That's for deploying configuration to Kubernetes and kind of managing it over time. And then there's actually a few other tools. They're probably less known than these two. kbld is probably the next one that folks hear about. It kind of helps you integrate your Docker building into this Kubernetes deployment workflow. So yeah, that was kind of a small history of Carvel.
Yeah. So when I said toolchain earlier, I mean it's definitely something. A set of tools that are trying to kind of improve the developer experience across the entire lifetime of a Kubernetes application. It's kind of the vibe I was getting from all the different moving parts and stuff like that.
Yeah, well, one of the key points that I was trying to explore here is how do you actually have this separate tools that do this distinct things like deployment versus configuration management? How do you keep them separate but yet have them play very well together? So kind of following the UNIX philosophy.
Yeah, that makes sense. Total sense. So let's just pull up. I have the website shared here. And what we can see is that you kind of broke this down into two sets of tools. So we've got, I guess, what are the core tools on the top, and then you've got some more experimental stuff, I guess, you're working on the bottom.
That's right. So there's actually behind Carvel, there's now a team at VMware, and after various deliberations and whatnot, we decided to kind of separate this high-level, quite mature tools from something that we're experimenting or messing around with.
Yeah, that makes sense. So today we're going to get hands-on with these tools, which I'm very happy about. But before we do that, I guess, would it be fair to say that these tools directly compete with Kustomize and Helm and just writing straight up YAML? Like this is a tool chain to replace all of that from people's lives.
That's right. Yep.
Okay. I'm definitely excited then. One of my biggest I think I ran about this probably on a weekly basis on Twitter, but just using Go templates inside of Helm charts and fighting with wrangling YAML value files to me is just is quite cumbersome. And I'm hoping that some of the tools that we look at today can make that a lot better. Do you use Go templates language? Is that a thing?
You mean outside of YTT, or occasionally, still have to deal with various configurations here and there. Yeah.
I should probably just bite the bullet and start learning it and get better at it instead of complaining about it. But then, what would I rant about on Twitter otherwise? So.
That's right. Gotta have some material.
All right. So step one of every episode that I do here is how do I install the tools? What is the de facto best definitive way for me to install the Carvel toolchain?
You can scroll down a little bit down to the page, and there's a few installation methods there. Since these are separate tools, you can either use a script to install them all together, or you can select individual tools from their GitHub, download releases pages, or you can use Brew, for example, if you're on Mac. Or actually, Brew works on Linux, I found out. So yeah, someone wanted to use Brew on Linux, so it was quite caught off guard there.
Yeah, I mean, I started a new position recently with Packet, and I got a Mac as part of that role, and I'm still fighting against it. I am a Linux user and trying to get myself accustomed to Brew as package manager. I mean, I come from Arch Linux. I've got the AUR there, and it's just everything in the world is packaged. So.
Yep.
So I'm no stranger to curl bash either, but I will play it safe and use the brew tap. At least then I'll get some updates.
Hey, actually, as you can see, the brew tap is still called K14S. We've been slowly updating the names. We recently renamed the Slack channel in our Kubernetes, I guess, in the Kubernetes Slack from K14S to Carvel.
So what inspired that name change then?
Inspired might be a wrong name for that, but within VMware, there is certain naming guidelines, and so this was one of the things that we wanted to comply with and be friendly to marketing and other folks within the organization. The K14S name was just something that me and my friend picked as a short thing to type. But it was never meant to be a kind of a top level marketing name.
Well, if the internet is to be believed, the K14S is Kubernetes tools.
That is right. We actually counted those letters, but then somebody told us that you're not supposed to count the space between Kubernetes and tools. So at that point, we just said, you know what? K13S would be unlucky. So we went with K14S.
I like it. All right, so now that my brew is finished, this should mean in theory, I got access to YTT, app, kbld. Oh, okay, excellent.
Yep.
So I guess now, and it would help if for once in my life I remember to start Docker before the call. But we'll give that 30 seconds to get healthy, and I should have a working Kubernetes cluster.
What's the choice over here for how you run Kubernetes? Do you typically use built-in Docker, built-in Kubernetes in Docker, or something else?
So I keep changing. I've been playing a lot lately. I've been dabbling with Kind running inside of Docker for Mac, which works pretty well. I really like Minikube. I just like the direction that they're going in, and I've been trying to use that with the new VMware Fusion 12, which because they've got the new player release, which is like a week old or whatever, but it's free for personal use. So now I can use that for hopefully a slightly better experience.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Minikube as well, just for the sake that it comes with a Docker instance that you can directly build and it's available to the cluster.
Well, yeah, I have run into a few problems running Kind inside Docker for Mac. So edge cases usually, but they're quite prominent. All right, so we've got the tools installed. I'm assuming now I have a cluster I could spell. that is my Docker for Mac cluster, because I see VPN kit, and I've got some cluster API stuff running, but we'll just ignore that for now. So when we were chatting earlier, we were talking about the direction that we wanted to play with these tools. Now we could have jumped straight into YTT, which is the templating side of the YAML aspect of it. But you were also saying that it might actually make more sense to trying to play with kapp first to deploy a workload to our cluster. So
That's right.
I think let's go with that. How do I use kapp, and how do I deploy something to my cluster?
Well, I guess one way to look at kapp is that it's meant to track the resources that you're deploying to the cluster. And the way it tracks it is by applying a label, and then it associates a name to it. So you should be able to take any plain YAML out there, maybe some kind of a Kubernetes example of sorts somewhere, and just use the deploy command under kapp to deploy it.
Okay. So one of the things, I maintain some Helm charts for InfluxDB. I did template out some YAML, which we can use with. But for the sake of the kapp stuff, what I'm going to say is let's just keep it really simple for now. Deploy Nginx with the most basic configuration I can think of. And this will be okay for the demonstration purposes, yeah?
Should be.
So what you said there was I can use kapp, and it has some sort of deploy subcommand. Yeah.
Yep.
And does that just work like my
it's going to be it's going to be -f, but in addition to -f, you'll have to throw in -a, which stands for the name of the app.
I have to name my app, so I can just call that Nginx.
Sounds good.
Right.
Yep, there it is.
So this is telling me that it has to make some changes to my cluster. So already this is doing some sort of, I don't know, preemptive reconciliation. It's looking at what's in my cluster, looking at those labels you mentioned, and trying to work out what changes are actually going to happen.
Right. So it I believe most folks are familiar with Terraform, right? And within Terraform, there's this idea of planning and then applying the change set that it planned, right? And so we've done same exact thing in kapp, where we first do a planning session of what's going to happen. And as you can see over here, we have a single resource, and the operation of it is going to be create, because kapp didn't find that resource in the cluster. And then it just presented you that plan. So you can go ahead and apply the plan. And kapp promises you that it's going to do only what's in the plan, right? So it's not going to go off and like change something else. So you can be 100% certain whatever is shown to you, that's what's going to happen.
All right, so I can see that it's created my deployment. Is then waiting for changes. So it's actually observing the replica sets in the pods being created.
That's right. Yep. We wanted to make it a little bit more friendly to finding out what's actually happening in the cluster. A lot of times, right, you just apply a bunch of stuff and you have no idea when it's done. So kapp has some effectively logic for checking out various resources, and so this case I think was deployment, right? So it knows how to wait for a deployment based on the deployment status.
Okay.
And hopefully it's useful information to know, it looks like the container was pending to be created, and then eventually it got created.
So I mean, the first thing that's jumping right into my head now is that what if I break this? What does kapp do? Like, let's say I come in here and let's put those resource constraints back in, right? And if I set them far too small, to the point where Nginx won't be able to start, does that trigger anything with kapp?
It might. It depends what the resource, I guess, is bubbling up to its status, right? So it depends if the deployment is showing that kind of information. Kapp may also sometimes look into the associated resources, like the pods that are related to the deployment, and raise some of their information, bubble up that to the user. We actually recently, I think, had what was it? I don't remember. There was actually a request in improving some of this logic to show this other more rarely seen condition pop up. But yeah, it depends. I mean, we can check it out and see what happens.
Okay, so this is our first update. Is now
Yep.
when
Actually,
cluster query the labels, and it's telling me.
you can even do maybe if you control C out of this and then run the same command but with -C, you'll see some hopefully diff over here that shows you what's actually being changed.
That's nice. I like that.
So that diff is per resource.
Okay, I like that flag. Like actually seeing the diff essentially before I hit the apply is pretty nice.
Yep. So it looks like Nginx is pretty happy.
Well, I thought I was sabotaging Nginx. It turns out it didn't care. So
You might have to really get those. I'm not even sure if that's gonna. Yeah.
what if we pick a tag that doesn't exist? Will that trigger some sort of failures?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there should be somewhere image pool.
Yeah, we should get an image.
Yeah.
So we can see that diff again, which I really like that feature. That's pretty nice. And there we go. I see a 404.
Yeah. So.
Ending loop. So.
Yep. So by default, kapp will wait until. So this kind of interesting, right? Because there's no, Kubernetes is continuously reconciliating, right? Because maybe the Nginx 44 is going to show up in the next 5 minutes, right? Who knows, right? But various resources, right, have defined their own rules, like deployment, I think, has a condition that indicates that the deployment isn't progressing after some time, right? And you can actually tweak it, I think, on the deployment. So kapp follows those kind of rules just by observing the status, but it also has a global timeout for 15 minutes, I think. So if we sit here for 15 minutes, kapp will tell you that nothing is really progressing. It's probably time to give up. Obviously, that's configurable, but best case scenario is that you want to be actually changing. You want to be changing the your resources to have this tight feedback loop, right? The most common might be like adding a readiness probe to your pods, right? Such that they don't just immediately become available. They, they take their time to start up properly.
Okay. Well, yeah, let's not watch it for 15 minutes. So I just reverted that image change, applied that to my cluster. I've got it just kind of saying, yeah, we're good. If I run that again, it's just saying, hey, there's nothing to do. It's a no op, and we're good.
Yeah, cool other command actually is kapp inspect. If you give it a -a nginx, you should be able to see, what's part of this app. We might even see the old pod. No, the old pod is already gone. But you can actually see that Kubernetes actually keeps a few replica sets, right? And I think that depends on like the history parameter of a deployment or something like that. I guess it's for fast rollback or something like that. But yeah, this kind of gives you maybe a full view of what's kapp seeing under this app.
Oh yeah, I guess we've got a bit of a contrived deployment right now, a very basic Nginx. There's not a lot going on, but I can see how that inspects, passing in the app name and getting back that list of resources that are being deployed together. I guess in a real world or production-like scenario where I'm deploying a real microservice that maybe has a backend database, that has config maps and secrets, like this inspect view is actually going to be much more useful in that scenario.
It's definitely, I've actually learned quite a bit after digging in on what kind of various resources get created. Like, a lot of people know about like kubectl get all, but get all actually doesn't show you everything, right? It only shows you the things that are tagged as all, or whatever, I guess the proper term is, not tagged probably. But there's quite a lot other, sets of resources. And so inspect actually is quite interesting to look at. Yeah.
Awesome. So is there anything else within kapp that we should take a look at?
Well, it kind of, the way to put it, there's a lot of kind of opinions that I've baked into it, working with various other systems before Kubernetes. I've been, I guess, in the deployment and configuration game for some time, and so kapp tries to, I guess, bake in a lot of interesting features that are helpful. So for example, one of them is a lot of people run into a challenge when a resource needs to change, but Kubernetes doesn't allow you to change that resource because, I don't know, it's the field is immutable or something like that, right? And so from a kind of a declarative perspective, right, how do you actually deal with that, right? Nobody wants to be sitting there and doing all kinds of manual changes to your cluster, right? And so kapp, for example, has special annotations to control various behavior of what it can do. So it can say, for example, if you see that the resource is invalid, and you've marked off explicitly that this resource is okay to recreate for updates, then it will automatically do this kind of work for you. So yeah, there's, I guess as people start using kapp in their environments, they start asking interesting questions like, how do I order, for example, running a DB migration job before actually updating the deployment, things like that. And so kapp, for example, has a feature for ordering the changes to be applied to a cluster. So yeah, there's a few interesting sneaky, I guess, maybe features that are not that you don't have to use, but you can kind of opt into.
Okay, so let's talk about this with a little bit of a wider scope now then. Do you see kapp as a tool that people would use to deploy normal Kubernetes manifests like we were doing, or you probably see it in a way that people should be having YTT manifests with kapp deploying them as a resource? Does that make sense, or have I got that wrong?
So the beauty of, I guess, embracing this, solving these problems in multiple tools, right, is that really it's up to the user to decide what kind of complexity they need to tackle in their workflow, right? Some users, of course, want to be able to have configuration that could be applied to multiple environments. It might be slightly different in production. They may decide to use customize, or maybe they decide to use YTT, or maybe they're using Helm charts, or whatever it is, right? And so the way I look at it, actually, I've explicitly said that it's not, I guess, it's not something that we want to constrain. Like this tool is only for deploying, I don't know, plain YAMLs, something like that. It's really just tool deploying Kubernetes resources. And if you happen to generate them from YTT, great. If you happen to generate them through Customize or Helm template, or I don't know, Q or whatever else, right? Maybe even some JSONnet tooling, whatever. We should be happy with that. But yeah, I do see it as a tool that the regular app developer can use when they're deploying their own software that they've written, or they could be using it to deploy something that the third party have provided them, or it's something that maybe some of the open source projects like Cert Manager or whatever else is going on, right? So I see it as kind of a scaling with your needs.
Okay, so that leads me on to two different things then. I think just because I'm a particularly curious person, what I'm going to do is run this deploy, because I want to see what happens when I point at those manifests I generated earlier. I just want to see that preview with slightly more going on. Okay. So I can see the RBAC, the cluster rules, persistent volumes, the services. Cool. I really do like that feature. That's particularly useful.
Yeah, one interesting thing actually that I look at this diff is, as you can see there's a few cluster resources versus there's a few resources that go in the namespace. Kapp doesn't really make a difference between a resource that's namespaced versus a cluster level one. It doesn't really care if it's a CRD or not. It'll just be managing it in the same exact way. So there's that benefit to just having a same behavior applied to all of these resources.
All right, cool. Now, one more thing on kapp then. When we were on the website, there was a controller for kapp. Do you want to
That's
give
right.
us a little bit of insight in that? Is that something that runs in the cluster in a GitOps fashion or something else?
Yep. So the idea there is if you
There we go.
if you think about what most people are doing, right? There's some kind of a fetching of configuration going on, right? There's some kind of a mangling, like templating or I don't know, overlaying or whatever going on. And ultimately there's, the last step, deploy, right? And so we've decided to codify that workflow in a CRD. And so you get to specify an app CR. Actually, if you scroll up here, there's the examples folder over here.
Yep.
There might be some of them might be a little, like maybe Concourse Helm or something, or Nginx Helm. Yeah.
Yeah, Nginx Helm. Let's take a look at that.
So, yeah, AppCR effectively splits that up into these three sections: fetch, template, and then deploy. And deploy obviously is happening with cap. Fetching and templating are actually they're decoupled steps, and there's various strategies like fetch it from Git, fetch it from your Docker registry. So we also are believers of putting configuration into Docker images. That way, all your assets are together. Or maybe it's fetch a Helm chart, right? And then the templating step could be also separate. So, for example, in this case, we're using Helm template to template the Bitnami and Nginx, but we're also using YTT on top of that to change how the service is configured for Nginx. And then ultimately we do a deploy at the end of that. So it kind of it's a opinionated way to do your deploys to the cluster, and because the controller, it keeps on doing them, right? So you can decide whether you want to float kind of on the latest reference or whether you want to lock it down to a particular thing. So yeah, it's a controller that's meant to represent that 95% case.
Okay, cool. Let's pop back.
Actually, maybe one thing to note is more after kind of building up the controller, I figured, well, you can use all these tools locally yourself, right? To kind of replicate that workflow if you want to debug, for example, if you just want to iterate on it quickly. But I was also thinking making a CLI that's effectively the same thing that the kapp-controller does, right? It's maybe literally even the same code, right? But just happens to run locally, where you can have maybe like run it once kind of a thing. So kind of an interesting idea of making it more, I guess, localized when you're developing stuff.
Yes, there is one of my colleagues, Jason Tibereth, is actually working on a proof of concept right now of a local binary that emulates Kubernetes API server without having any API server. So I'll drop you that link. It might be something interesting for you.
Yeah, I think I've seen it actually on Twitter. This in our case, I think we actually don't need Kubernetes. We just need that inner loop that does the reconciliation, so you wouldn't have to fetch any resources. But yeah, I see what you're getting at.
I think there's a lot of things that could. I mean, we want the Kubernetes API because it's nice and declarative, but we don't necessarily need the cluster. We just need a daemon that could run locally or be run once. I think there's a good market for applications there. All right, let's move on over then to this templating thing. We've got YTT here. So I understand kapp now. That makes perfect sense to me. I like the functionality that brings to the table. The kapp-controller I think is really sweet. I'm looking forward to playing with that at some point where I can, have that running inside my cluster. Now I want to get rid of Helm, or at least the templating bit or the customizing bit. And this is where YTT slots right in. Yeah.
Yep, that's right. Templating and overlaying. That's the goal for this tool.
Okay, so when we talk about templating, we're talking about the exact same thing that Helm does. And when we talk about overlays, we're talking about modifying or tweaking those generated templates per environment, right?
Yeah, so over the years, I guess I've come to a conclusion. I don't know if people agree with that conclusion or not, but I think you have to use templating and overlaying together to cover the use cases that you have, right? Because we've seen that if you don't have the overlaying, then a lot of people, as Helm chart, let's say, gets more mature, a lot of people keep on asking, like, well, let's add one more configuration knob into your values, right? And so you end up with 1,000 values there. And, you know, those values are probably used by, like, each one is used by one person only. And so really, I think, you know, 95% cases that are common between people should be something like, you know, values should be just templated by the author. There's no, you know, crazy indirection that they need to deal with. It's just right there inside the template. But there's, let's say, a 5% case where an end user wants to actually, you know, modify something, right? And there's no way that they have this in data values because it's not a common thing to modify. Maybe it's very specific to their cluster. Maybe it's specific to their environment, whatever it is. And so having a single tool that has the consistent kind of a methodology for both of those approaches, in my mind, I think is actually advantageous. So yeah, YTT tries to do both.
Okay, excellent. I mean, that thing you just mentioned there about adding one new thing to the values.yaml and it's probably consumed by one person is definitely a problem that I face with the InfluxDB and the Telegraph Helm charts, particularly Telegraph, because every time Influx add a new plugin to Telegraph, someone comes along with a pull request, adds a new values format to enable that plugin for their deployment. And there's over 200 plugins. And you end up in this really unruly hellhole, you know, I'm just going to call it a hellhole, where you have to try and convert YAML to TOML for the Telegraph configuration.
Mm-hmm.
And it's nothing but painful. So let's see what we can do here then. Now, what's the best way for us to kind of play with this? Should we just start writing some?
So there is a playground here that's interactive. Just kind of gives you a feel for what the tool does. There's actually quite a few people have really liked the playground, so that was a good call on my friend's part on making that a priority. That's Nima Kaviani. He works now at I think AWS. But yeah, the playground is a good way to start kind of learn. There's a few examples there. If you scroll up just a little bit, yeah, if you think that you want to kind of take maybe some YAML and try to make it maybe template it a little bit, that could be a good start.
Okay, so let me throw a question at you first then. Assuming I am an application developer that's already deploying stuff to Kubernetes, so just basic YAML manifest right now, is the approach to adopting YTT to incrementally swap bits in and out of that, or to just rewrite everything as YTT?
It's a great question. Yeah, one of the interesting side effects of being a templating tool that really deals with structures, right, and more specifically YAML, is that really a YAML file is a valid YTT template. It's, you know, YTT just reads it in and spits out the same exact thing, right? There's no, let's say, variable substitutions or anything like that. The simplest thing, you know, to kind of level up, let's say there is some kind of value that you want to insert, maybe it's different for two different environments, right? The simplest thing is just literally throw in, you know, one little usage of YTT within that YAML, and, you know, it might be one line or two lines, and that's how you really get started. So yeah, the intent is definitely not to change any of your YAML configuration. It's more just start out and just add some of these directives over time, if you need to, you know.
Then what I would suggest is, I mean, right now I could run YTT against this nginx.yaml, and you're saying I'll just get the same YAML back. That
should be. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So do I just do -f again like this?
Yep. That's right. Yep.
Okay, so let's then tackle the first. One of my many annoyances with Kubernetes YAML is the duplication between the selector and the labels. Is that something we can then template out with YTT, so we only define it once?
Yep, absolutely. So YTT, because it's dealing with structures, right? And, you know, as we can see on line 12 and 8, right, we have a single map item, right? A map, right? So we can pull that map out into a function and just call the function from two different places. And all that really requires is, cutting out the app nginx and moving it up to the top level of the document and wrapping it in a def. So
That's
you
easy
might,
to check
this
there, right?
probably referring to an example is a little easier to explain there, or to show at least. The key there is that YTT directives are all YAML comments, so they just leave along the YAML nodes, and everything that's prefixed with pound at, it's an annotation, what we call within YTT, and these annotations effectively tell YTT where certain things are kind of like this is a definition of a function, or this is a for loop, let's say, or this is whatever it is, right? So we're using a Pythonic language called Starlark from Google. Great language, great library to use. And it's effectively the YAML gets converted, at runtime to a template that's fully written in Starlark, and then Starlark gets executed, and you get the output back. So yeah, if you grab like line 3 from this example over here, and just drop it in before, yeah, and then we also will close it, yeah. There you go. So now we have a function, and all it takes now is to call that function from multiple places. And so to call it would be if you go to line 11, actually, if you write it out right here, yeah, so if you do pound at labels, yeah. So what's happening here is actually it's not going to quite work because we don't know if you mean that the value of match labels should be the result of the labels function. It could just be calling a function in the middle of a YAML. And so if you drop it in on the same line as match labels, then YTT is going to know that, hey, you're actually calling a function. And also you'll have to throw in the 2 parentheses at the end of that as a kind of a regular function call.
All right. Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah.
All right. Is
So
there
yeah,
a
so
way
that's-
to keep my editor happy, or is it always just going to moan at me when I'm?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure. Is this VS Code?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what it's complaining about right now. We do have a VS Code plugin that we've recently started out, and we'll probably iterate on. Yeah, I'm not sure if what exactly it's not happy about, but oh yeah, I guess
No
it's
value. So I mean, if I drop this in, will YTT then replace that value, or is it going to?
So YTT is actually not going to be quite happy with providing the static value and the value that's going to get generated through YTT, and mostly because it might be just confusing to users, like what's happening over here, and so we wanted to prevent that. We may open it up later, not quite sure. We're trying to be as strict as possible today in terms of the rules, and so we can always loosen them up. But yeah, today YTT is going to complain at you saying that's not allowed.
Okay, so let's do that. I like to see things work. So I can see those labels being injected. You're saying this is going to tell me no. Yeah.
Yep.
So it's saying expect YAML node to either have a computed or blah blah blah. Oh, because it's got both, right? Okay.
That's right.
Okay. So I will.
Yeah, and of course, now that we have this function, right, we can call it as many times as you want. So like on line 14, you could also call it. Should be all happy.
Great. Nice. Okay, that makes sense to me. So we're using Starlark language to define functions. We're going down the comment approach so that the YAML can still be read by other YAML files, I guess, or syntax highlighting works. Or
There's kind of an interesting world, right? Just because the template is YAML, you do get some benefits from other tools, right? But for example, a lot of tools, they strip out comments, right? Because they're just not aware that, hey, I should keep the comments, which over time, I guess that may get fixed through improvements in YAML libraries like the Go YAML v3. But yeah, the main motivation for making the template in YAML itself was specifically for being able to read the YAML structure and then overlay the metadata on top of that. YTT lint. This is actually one of the. There was a person from SAP. He was experimenting with how to do some type checking inside this kind of a world. But yeah, VS Code YTT is from Eli. That was his experiment and kind of improving that. But yeah, we've got some work to do there.
Well, I mean, I've installed that lint one, and right away my little red squiggle of death has gone away. So I'm pretty happy.
Fair enough.
All right, cool. So something that jumped out at me in the playground example here. What is this load statement at the top? I couldn't really work that out right away.
So in Helm, I believe you can just say like dot values dot something, right? It's kind of like the values is globally available. We've tried in YTT templates to be very explicit about where things come from. So for example, if you wanted to move a function into a separate file, right, the labels function that we've written, you would have to do an explicit load of that file to grab that function, right? So explicit export, explicit imports of whatever variables or functions that you care about. Same applies to the built-in YTT modules. So YTT comes with various modules, like data one is to get the data values that the user has provided to us. There's various ones like base64 to encode or decode things. Maybe there's for example, overlay functionality in YTT is actually implemented as a module, so you can programmatically do some overlaying yourself. So yeah, there's various modules that it includes. And so here we're saying, please import the data module, and under data module, there's data.values, which allows you to use what the user has provided to us.
Okay, that makes sense to me. So the next thing then I think that makes sense for this example would be thinking of the Helm. What I would do in Helm is I would be able to define things globally that could be applied in multiple templates. Is there a way to do that with YTT?
Yeah, so when you say globally, do you mean like a same function or something like that? Or
oh yeah, so if I say this was split across two files and I've got a service.yaml here, I wouldn't necessarily want to define the labels in each.
Got it. Yep, makes sense. Yep. So yeah, so at this point you would say, so you would have a service.yaml that has that service, and we would create actually a separate file called maybe, I don't know, deployment.lib.yaml, and that's where we would put our function so that we can import it from both places.
Okay, so I can just I'll call it abc.yaml.
That's right. Yeah. One thing you do have to call it .lib.yaml as the extension. So for now we put that restriction to avoid kind of people importing templates themselves from other templates. And so everything that's labeled as lib.yaml is importable by the regular templates.
Okay. So I have my .lib.yaml, and you're saying I can just
Yep.
move this function over there.
That's right.
And then to consume that function from here first, because right now I've got my YTT lint is kicked in and going, hey, this doesn't exist. So
yep. So yeah, you would use a @ at the top, and then space, and then type in load, and then you would open parentheses. I think it's like double quotes at YTT. Oh, actually, no, at YTT. Yeah, it's abc.libyaml. I bet. Yep. And then the second argument would be the name of the function. So it's going to be a string as well. Yep. So that should make the labels available. Yeah, I'm not quite sure if YTT lint has been, I think it's been used for it's been experimented a long time ago, so it may not know certain things. But yeah, this should be okay.
Okay, so based on this syntax here, if I had 10 different functions inside of my library YAML, would they all need imported individually? Is there a way to just bring in everything?
So it's kind of interesting. The Starlark language defines this. So load is actually not a function, but it's a special, I guess, keyword or directive and it does require you to specify all of the symbols that it imports. However, the trick here is that if your ABC lib YAML has lots of functions, you could actually create a little structure that holds them all, and all you got to do is import the little structure over here. So it may be like structure little ABC, and then you would say abc.labels. So it's actually kind of bundling it up into a little object, and then you just import the little object altogether. We actually consider adding a different way of doing a load to kind of be more closer to what I believe JavaScript folks do when they just assign a return of the load to a variable and just user of that. Might be a little bit more friendlier, I guess.
So just to kind of elaborate on what you said there, I mean, were you suggesting that I would do something like this?
No. So you would still keep the labels. So we are importing a symbol on line 1, the label's name. So you wouldn't want to be changing the YAML itself. So let's just say that you have a second function over here. Maybe you can copy it and have 2 of them now here. Yeah, so now you actually have 2 symbols, labels and labels2, that you have to export, right? And so instead of the user on the other side importing them manually, kind of one by one, you can create this thing called a struct. So it's effectively a better looking map, if you will. So I don't remember if we have an example of that, but actually we might have an example in the YTT repo, because I believe someone was asking about this. Might be in the docs somewhere. Let me see if I can find it real quick. Load. Oh yeah, there it is. So I'll send you a link over here real quick. If you scroll down just a little bit, keep on scrolling down. So there you go. So it says right under your cursor, it says to load a set of functions from a single file. You can do effectively that. So what that allows you to do is just make a little object that has 2 fields, label and labels1. So right now it's a little verbose, I would say. Definitely want to improve on that, but that would be one way to go about it.
All right, okay. So I guess random stuff just keeps popping up in my head now. Do I need to define this as YAML, or can I use .star to then, get syntax highlighted and other things for my functions?
So it's an interesting kind of a choice to make, right? So when you're writing templates, you might be dealing with functions that return a bunch of structures, right? And to me, let's say if you're defining a structure, it's way easier to just, maybe write it in YAML or copy paste it from somewhere that's already written in YAML, right? And so a lot of times I would say, since you're dealing with YAML, I would just stick with libyaml, right? Now, if you're writing maybe functions that are more, I don't know, compute related, like maybe you're multiplying things and adding things and maybe, appending strings or whatever it is, right? You might actually not be using a lot of the YAML structures at all, right? And so at that point, I would say it makes sense to, let's say, put it in a .star file, and then, it is the same exact kind of load directive from the other side. In this case, I guess the example does have it as the star file, where you just have, returning 2 integers for whatever reason. But yeah, it's really up to the end user to decide. If they're dealing with a lot of YAML, then stick with libyaml. If they're not, then star is also fine.
And I'm assuming because this is I think it's a subset of Python, I would just return a Python dictionary here, and that would return me something that looks like YAML.
You could definitely do that. Yep. So dictionaries will be converted to the regular YAML maps. Actually, since we mentioned this, there is another type of templates that YTT can deal with, is textual templates. Since when you're dealing with Kubernetes, sometimes you have to actually do some textual templating, which maybe, I don't know, for whatever reasons is more appropriate for whatever you're doing. And so you could actually have a lib.txt, right, that has a function that's really doing some kind of a nice textual formatting, right? And so that's kind of another, I guess, consideration to make when writing those templates.
Okay. There's a lot going on here. I think there's a lot of options. But what you're saying there, quite succinctly, was just stick to the libyaml approach. Use use that until you need to break out for something that's a bit more complicated or fits a different purpose.
That's right.
Okay, cool. I will stick with the YAML. Okay, we're back. So we have kind of looked at the functions, we've imported the functions. I mean, that all works pretty self-explanatory. What about now if I want to tweak this Nginx deployment for a staging or production deployment, and the number of replicas is going to change? So let's set replicas to 100, which I only want to prod. So how do I go about overlaying this to make this tweakable?
So if we do want to use an overlay, we would actually have a separate file. It could be like overlay.yaml or replicas.yaml.
Okay. Overlay.yaml.
And the trick here, right, is that the world of overlay, at least in my mind, is split into two kind of steps, right? One step is to find what you're trying to overlay on top. And the second step is what the operation you want to do once you found it, right? So for example, we want to find a particular resource, deployment in our example, right? And we also want to find spec.replicas, and then we want to replace the value of it, right? So it might be a little easier to copy from one of the examples. Let's see if we got a overlay example. I believe we do. It's actually, let's see if we got it. So there's overlay files. Yeah, okay. Overlay files, example 16 might be what you're looking for. So here, the overlay is, I guess, there's actually two overlays here. One is in ops1 YAML and one is in ops2 YAML. So we can probably grab the entire thing in ops1 YAML and just modify it to our need. So on line 1, right, we see that we're loading in the overlay library. That's not always necessary, but in this case, because we're using an overlay module functionality on line 3, that's why it's needed there. And then on line 3, we're saying, let's find something that has metadata name example ingress 1, right? So in our case, we probably want to be doing some other finding, right? Like, what are we actually looking for?
So I guess we could do metadata labels.
You might have to wrap it in another set of hash then for the app, right? Yeah.
So, and then this was app nginx.
Yeah.
We could do something like that, right?
That's right. In fact, we could have even used our function over here if we really wanted to, right? For the labels to get the same label in here. A lot of times I've seen people actually do is use the kind and the name of the object to kind of identify it uniquely enough within their configuration, but this will also do. So overlay subset just tries to find whatever is kind of a shared.
So just to confirm.
So yeah, and then so once we found this object, so by default we're going to, or by default YTT overlay functionality expects that it's going to find one object. So for whatever reason we don't have that one copy of that object that matches this subset, then it's going to tell us, hey, hold on, something is wrong. And then so instead of the whole metadata annotations removal, we'll be just doing spec replicas, right? Yep, that's right. That's all there is to it.
Okay, so there's something I want to confirm there. What I think you suggested was I could use the labels function here.
That's right. Yep.
And so I would just have to copy that import.
Yep.
And to my overlay. So, did I mess that up? Yeah.
There's one more. Yep, there's one more missing there. There you go.
Okay, so from the command line now, how do I piece this together?
So there's an interesting property of YTT is that it doesn't allow any kind of, so the execution environment is very self-contained, right? There's no way to access time, there's no way to access file system, no network, no nothing, right? And so because we're doing all these loads, we actually have to give the files to YTT that we're trying to load. So in this case, it would be like YTT-F nginx, -F overlay, -F abc lib YAML. Yep. All right, so
that error you said was going to happen if we didn't get a match.
It says expected number of match nodes to be 1, but was 0. You know what? That is true. Yeah, the labels that we're actually trying to find is not inside the metadata, right? It's elsewhere. Because we didn't have anything, yeah.
Well, let's just make that work, right?
Yeah, why not? I guess it is metadata. Yeah, this is actually one of the goes back to that idea of being as strict as possible, right? Because you want to find those errors as at your configuration time, not at the time when you're deploying and things are not working, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think that's a good thing for it to catch. And the alternative to me clobbering that together there would just be to update the overlay and do spec, selector, and then match labels.
That's right. That would be an alter. Yep. I think you have to throw in one more. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Spec, selector, match labels, rather than just throwing new labels into our metadata. That worked. Nice. And then we have our replicas of 1. So from I guess some sort of deployment pipeline where I was piecing this together, my deployment pipeline would have to be environment aware, that it could just pull in the correct overlay and it's just going to work.
That's right. Yep. And a lot of times we actually we see folks switch, instead of using individual files, they just use directories, right? So you can have a config directory that contains nginx YAML and abclib YAML. And then they may also have like a production directory that contains whatever overlays you need to contain, right? So you're not really concerned about, which files are individually included, right? You're just relying on, the file system to tell you what's what.
Okay, so you're saying I can move this into a deploy directory. I need my library here. Okay, so my command could then
you do want to move the library into the deploy as well, since it's being imported by nginx YAML directly.
It's also being imported by our overlay. Does that mean I have to put the path here like this?
So actually no, yeah, this should work. You just have to remember, you just have to remember to include it through -f. Yeah.
Right, okay, so the first thing I would do is say include any libraries that I need. I could then specify my deploy directory followed by my overlay directory.
Yep.
Nice, and it still works, okay.
Yeah, what's interesting is that, I've previously been involved in various tooling that was always very strict. And so this time I've tried to make it just kind of a little less opinionated in terms of how you integrate with your workflows and Unix environment and whatnot. Because a lot of people out there, they're doing all kinds of DIY installations of Kubernetes cluster, and they have their own opinionated workflows, right? And so we want to cater to that, right? If you really want to kind of separate them, maybe you have 10 different ways of how you overlay things. Maybe it's like dev and then like dev extra and whatever else. Like it's kind of up to you how you manage the files. There are benefits and downsides to that approach, right?
Yeah, definitely. But I'm really starting to get a good picture now of how these tools come together, how they work together, and the kind of responsibilities for each, which I think is starting to make them look very, very interesting. So we're kind of approaching an hour now. So what I would like to say is we can definitely demo anything else that you think is important for people to see, or maybe we could just do a quick few minute recap of the other tools and what their responsibilities are. And then I will thank you and say this has been really cool. So do you want to show off kbld, or should we just quickly talk about kbld, imgpk, and vendor?
I think we can talk about them. I think if folks are, interested to look in, it's there. They can also, jump in on our Slack channel, ask any questions. We're very responsive there. So I guess so kbld is trying to solve. Well, it started out as solving one particular problem, right? So we actually have this problem right now, right? We're just using image nginx, right? And so we never know what's it going to deploy, right? Because nginx latest will keep on moving, right? And so what kbld does, maybe we can actually showcase that real quick. is if we pipe the YTT output into kap, right? Right now, it's just going to say, let the cluster try to find the latest thing, right? But kbld actually finds the image references within your files and switches them from non-digest URLs to the digest reference URLs. And what that ultimately gets you, right, is that immutability of the config, right? So let's say if your deployment has been running for a long time in your cluster and for whatever reason some of the Nginx pods need to restart, right? There's not going to be a chance that when the pods do restart, they pick up an entirely different version of Nginx since the time you've deployed it in the first place, right? And so by using these digest URLs everywhere where kbld finds the image reference, you're kind of locking everything down. And on top of that, kind of the second step to that was, well, when you're developing locally, you actually may want to run your Docker build process, right, in the middle of all that, right? You have your configuration, you made some changes to your app, so you want to run the Docker build, and then you want to do a kap deploy. And so that's, of course, cumbersome for you to do. And so kbld, with a little bit of configuration, will actually go ahead and run the Docker build for you and replace the image reference with whatever got built, right? So kbld is really, I guess, focusing on how do you integrate into your deployment, pipeline, this image finding and building. And today, it can use like Docker build and pack build. So that's the build packs, folks.
Okay, that makes sense. I think what a lot of people don't realize is that when you deploy something to Kubernetes and you're using an image tag rather than content addressable SHAs, is that if that pod or that deployment runs on multiple nodes and that tag changes at some sort of random time, you could actually end up with two different versions of that image across your cluster, or more, depending on if a pod crashes and reschedules onto another node a week later and pulls in that tag which has been overwritten. I see it so many times where people end up with this completely weird cluster configuration with different versions of their image. So I really like that idea of kbld resolving those at deployment time and then pushing that to the cluster.
Yep, that's kind of how I ended up with that, separation of the concerns, because you do want it to make it pluggable for all the other folks out there, right? That, let's say, use Kustomize or Helm template or whatever it is, right? And so kind of a cousin of kbld is image package. We're actually moving some of the functionality of kbld into image package right now. The functionality that I'm talking about is ability to take a set of images and move them to your private registry. A lot of people call it relocation. So image package kind of combines the concept of you want to keep your configuration in a Docker registry right next to your images, right? So for example, if you decided to say InfluxDB version 1.1 is ready, you just push it up to the registry, and now it's under, I don't know, apps/InfluxDB configuration or something like that. But InfluxDB configuration is also referencing like 10 other images probably. And when you, let's say, dealing with an environment that needs to be all firewalled away from the public internet, right? You want to take all of that configuration and move it into their, registry. And so image package allows you to do that. Well, right now it's not quite there yet. We're actually, like I said, we're moving that functionality from kbld. But image package introduces this concept of a bundle where it's a image it's an application configuration plus a set of images that it references, and we kind of see it as one thing. And so that kind of allows you to manage your environment more confidently in terms of where the configuration is coming from, where the images are coming from.
Excellent. This all sounds really cool. It's pretty much a tool to make all of my Kubernetes painful experiences that little bit better. So it's great that these are all being worked on. So I think we've covered an awful lot today, and there's obviously so much more that people can pick up. So what I would recommend is there was a talk at KubeCon a few weeks ago. Is that correct?
That's
so
right. Yep.
Check that out. There is the Carvel channel on the Kubernetes Slack. And there's obviously the Git repositories as well. There's plenty of examples for people to go and start to experiment on their own and understand how the Carvel tools can help them. Is there anything you
Yep.
would like to add to that before we finish up, Dmitry?
Thank you for having me. It's been pretty fun. You know, I really like the format that you have going on. Yeah, no, that's pretty much it. We welcome anybody in our Slack channel to chat about various problems that they may have, and if it happens that we can help, that's even better.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you very much for joining me and taking the time out of your day to kind of show me the tools and walk me through it step by step. It's really helped me have a better understanding and hopefully the people that are watching on YouTube as well. So thank you. Have a great day, and I'll speak to you soon.
You too. Bye-bye.